You're only disruptive if there is something being put at risk.
A career founded on embracing the unconventional, this is Armando Turco.
When everyone is zagging you zig, give me the thing no one else wants, but I'll stand out as a result.
From redefining global storytelling at Oatly to scaling innovative content strategies at Vox Media, Armando challenges the status quo.
Sometimes people are going to choose your brand because it's better for the world, but most of the time people are going to choose your brand because it's cheaper or it tastes better or it works really well in a cappuccino.
We talked about the creative process and how you structure teams.
Process and micromanagement become substitutes for ambition and creativity. You are spending so much time agonizing over every word in your brief, and you think they all sound so unique and differentiated, and they don't.
And Armando shares stories behind some of the most standout work I've ever seen.
And I looked at that math and I was just like, holy shit, this might be the best idea ever. Oatly's such an amazing brand. First of all, I want to give props to everybody who's worked on that before, during your time, all that stuff. It's an oat milk brand. Like, as we're talking, we know this random oat milk brand, not from the US originally, that is such a big cultural phenomenon and so quickly rose to that point. Why do you think the Oatly brand is as great as it is?
A few things I would say. I think Oatly is sort of committed to a mission that's bigger than its own business and even bigger than oat milk as a product. And I think a lot of people know that, like, in a lot of ways that ties back to sustainability and climate change and like a need for us to shift behavior away from dairy consumption, which is one of the biggest contributing factors to climate change that there is. And that is like just blood that courses through the veins of the company and all of the employees and even amongst many of our consumers, our users, our followers. I think having like a sort of ruthless commitment to doing something that is truly worthy and necessary, because it is so committed to its mission, I think there was an understanding, and because the behavior is so entrenched, the behavior that we're pushing against is so entrenched, there was an understanding that we were going to need to be punk about how you go about creating that behavior change. And I didn't like, I'm not responsible for that. This is a mindset that predated me and my time at Oatly. But interestingly, like, everyone who walks in the door, or out the door for that matter, sort of walks in embodying that understanding. And it is not transmitted via brand books and manifestos and sizzle videos and whatnot. In fact, there's almost none of that. It's just a very active part of the DNA of the company. And it's something that's discussed all day, every day. And so there was an understanding we're going to have to be punk about how we go about creating that change, and not disruptive in the way that I think a lot of brands claim to be disruptive, but disruptive with stakes.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, you're only disruptive and you're only courageous if there is something being put at risk. And so all day, every day, if it felt like we were kind of veering towards compromising that mission, or veering from the voice, or veering from the sensibility and the style, there was a lot of permission to call each other out. There was a real commitment to just doing things differently, rejecting industry best practice. We paid almost no attention. I mean, certainly within the commercial side of the company, we paid a lot of attention to our competitors and what they were doing and how they were pricing and distributing and all of that. But like, from a brand and communications perspective, we didn't really pay close attention to the competitors because we actually didn't admire most of the competitors and the work that they were doing. And it was more worthwhile for us to look to cultural movements for inspiration, or to even look to other categories for inspiration. And it's like this idea that you should like model yourself after the brands that you want to be more like, not necessarily just after the ones that you're competing with or who are stealing share from you. Right. So there were just like a lot of very firm commitments to doing things differently and to embracing disruption as a challenger brand that I don't think you have to be a challenger brand in order to practice.
You said that like Oatly marketing is almost designed like a movement for this cause that you have. That is, we want to switch people from this like dairy belief to providing this alternative. And that's a cause that you are creating a movement towards. And that, I've never thought of it Oatly as that before, but now scanning back like years of work, I'm like, oh yeah, that is exactly what they were doing. They were just doing it in a fun way that I understood that they were doing that. And you brought up the example of Liquid Death, that like they also seem to be doing that. And when you scan back at all of their work checks out. It's not just, I feel like differentiating is a weird word to say, because differentiating almost a lot of times brands are just trying to do things differently than other people are, not into a direction or a cause. Like a cause is like a cause. You know, you're like, this is what we're trying to change the world, and we know exactly what we're trying to do. You almost don't need to differentiate yourself from anybody else, because you're not looking, there's no anybody else. You have a movement that you're trying to push. You have an agenda. You're like, this is where we want the world to go. This is what we're fighting for.
Or you're pushing against so many players, so many actors in this gigantic system that it's a fool's errand to sort of like target each of them individually. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're pushing against an idea. It gets so big that you're pushing against an idea, but I think that sort of elevates the ambition of the brand too, when you feel like this is what we're up against here is so much greater than us. You know, we weren't competing with Chobani, we're competing with milk that comes from a cow. You know what I mean?
You're trying to shift people from a habit of drinking cow's milk. You're not trying to differentiate yourself from Chobani. Those are like very different tasks. And they're so up top the funnel that it doesn't feel like they'll make different work, but they make completely different work.
Well, and then once you commit to either direction A or direction B, we committed to direction A. We
have a cause.
We exist to convert at least 50% of dairy drinkers to plant-based milk. And almost don't care if they choose Oatly or anything else. Which I think is also an important distinction. Which is one of the reasons why we never really directly, at least in the time that I was there, and we had lots of strategic and philosophical debates about this, but we would never directly attack a plant-based milk competitor. Because in some ways it's like, well, at least, but once you've sort of committed to that direction and you start double clicking into the how, another interesting debate would surface, which was like, do you have to talk about the mission in order to achieve the mission? And I think this is another place where a lot of brands go wrong, which is like they stand for one thing, or they have this like really macro kind of North Star goal, and then they're very transparent about that mission. And sometimes people don't want to hear about your purpose, about your very worthy mission, And so there were some times where we would very directly talk about climate change. I and my team, while I was there, did a campaign here in the States, which we then ended up replicating in parts of the UK and Europe, that we called the Climate Footprint Challenge, where Oatly was one of the first, if not the first, big CPG brand to start printing its climate footprint on the front of the label of its product, the CO2e number, right? So we took out billboards in 2 different locations in New York and in LA that were like companion billboards. So 2 side by side, very high impact, huge placements. And on one, we just said, we bought this ad to inform you that we've started to print our climate footprint on all of our products. And there was an image of the Oatly carton. And then on the adjacent billboard, it said, and we're reserving this space for the dairy industry to share their numbers with you too. And there was just like a hand-drawn illustration of a milk jug. And there was a QR code where the dairy industry could apply for free advertising. And it led them to a questionnaire of 130, I think it was 137 inputs on this questionnaire. And it so happens that there were 137 inputs that we used in the methodology to calculate our carbon footprint. Shockingly, no one applied. But we did that in a few different places. And the point I'm trying to make here is like, that was a campaign where we were very directly, we had some news to break and we thought this is the most interesting way for us to break this news. But also it was a statement of our mission, of our purpose, right? In most other cases, we almost never really talked about sustainability, climate change, the footprints. We never really, I mean, we often sort of challenged the dairy industry directly. But if you look at, I would say 60 to 70% of the Oatly work, whether it's social media content or our ad campaigns or what have you, like there's not even a tinge of that.
The strategy isn't showing.
Yeah, because sometimes people are going to choose your brand because it's better for the world. But most of the time, people are going to choose your brand because it's cheaper or it tastes better or it works really well in a cappuccino or you're funny. And you amuse me.
The mission of the company is very different than the purpose of the communication.
Yes.
And I think that people jump from, this is our mission, let's put it on a billboard.
Yes.
And that might be, it's important to have a really strong mission, because you can kind of see which companies do and don't. And the best marketed brands do have a mission and they have a cause, like you said.
Yeah.
But then they're not saying, this is our cause, by the way.
Every single time.
They're just doing we're going to do things within this cause. And you're going to see those things as different elements.
Yeah. And this goes back to your point about talk like a person.
Right.
If you, at every party that you attend, are only talking about climate change, people are going to be like, please don't invite that guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But if you could meet me and then get the sense that this guy feels like he cares about this stuff, he cares about this stuff, that's the best communication that I could do in a room. Yeah. You said billboards, which is, there's so many things that are fascinating to me about the Oatly brand, and hopefully we'll talk about all of them, but it feels like you guys did such non-traditional marketing, but the channels were oftentimes a lot very traditional. Billboards, packaging, very why? Talk to me about that for a second, because it feels like people who are trying to differentiate, or whatever you want to call it, or make a brand, they're like, well, we have to make a clock that says, let's do the Oatly fucking clock. Yeah. But you guys were doing billboards and packaging and that nailing basics. Talk to me about that. What was your choice on doing that?
Yeah, I think there were certain strategic motivations for it. But then there were also some practical reasons for it, right? I think to the outside world, it probably looks like Oatly is very rich in resources because we're this big global brand and we have a lot of heat and whatnot. But actually, the budgets were fairly conservative.
Yeah.
The team was not exceptionally large. At the time that I was at Oatly, in my first year, I was focused mainly on the North American region, and my team, including me, that was focused on everything from strategy, media planning, buying, creative development and execution, production, project management, partnerships, sponsorships, all of it was I think at its biggest in my 2.5 years, 14 people.
There's usually 14 people per department in there.
Yeah. And so there's the constraint of having a small team and relatively small budgets in comparison to big CPG brands, sort of fosters more creativity. It's not rocket science, right? And it also necessitates that there's sort of conversation at the heart of everything you do.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the media choices were made with that in mind, right?
How do we get more conversation?
In some ways, it's more impactful
Yeah.
To take out a billboard in the middle of a city and to say something, to use that space provocatively in a way that then generates, Instagram photos and social media chatter and PR and press pickup and what have you. And in particular, we did it in very cities that were sort of transient, where there's a lot of people coming in and out of them.
Paris,
tourist centers, what have you, right? Because it was honestly the most effective way for us to reach, at least in the States in the first few years. I don't think we advertised outside of New York and LA for many years. And that predates me, but I'm pretty sure I have that sort of historically accurate. But yet we sort of achieved a satisfactory level of awareness nationally because of just where we were situating ourselves. But a lot of it did start with, where can we get the biggest bang for our buck? When everyone was becoming more and more obsessed with advertising at scale and hyper-personalized digital communication, and all the rest of it that most of us spend 90% of our time now thinking about, it can actually be very disruptive for you to go back to basics. And so in some ways, we used what would have been considered traditional media non-traditionally.
Yeah.
And actually we're better for it. I remember there was a campaign that was running right when I started with the company. And we had hundreds, if not thousands of placements, but all of them were on the fronts of the buses in New York City. Nobody buys the front of the bus in New York City. Maybe they buy the back, but they're probably not buying a lot of bus out of home inventory, period. I think that was John Schoolcraft's idea. And he was like, we don't have a lot to spend. We want as much volume and frequency as we can possibly get. Get me all the bus fronts. And it was a really successful campaign, but it's like the epitome of like going back to basics and like just when everyone is zagging you zig or vice versa, and just like give me the thing no one else wants, but I'll stand out as a result.
Isn't it funny that when we talk about brand, it is what you said, 90% of the time we are thinking about hyper personalization. How do we get the person who likes red shirts to see a red shirt and see whatever, all the things in Norway and Norwegian, all that stuff. But then we talk about the greatest brands in the world currently, the Oatlys, the Liquid Deaths, they're not nailing the hyper personalization. They might be, but what we talk about, what they're doing really, really well is the basics.
Yeah.
And there seems to be this like chasm between what we think is important that's going to nail a good brand and what the brands that we herald at the top, and what they're doing. What's that like? Is our focus on the right side and hyper personalization 90% of the time? I was thinking about that. I'm thinking about scale and mass. Is that correct?
I don't really have an answer to that. I try to just always look at it from the perspective of the audience, and I think shockingly, a lot of us in our industry don't really spend a lot of time looking at advertising from the perspective of the person who's being advertised to.
Yeah.
Liquid Death will tell you that like ultimately their goal is to just be the topic of conversation for that week.
The funniest video online is their goal.
And I think, you know, I've not seen their quantifiable results, but I think just from what I see,
seems to work.
They're pretty successful at it, right? I also think right now in particular, and for the past few years, there's just been such an explosion of technology and capability, a lot of which I guess, like technically speaking on a spreadsheet sort of drives greater efficiency and ROI. But I think the industry is just doing a lot of stuff just because it can. Yeah. And there's like a feeling that like, because we have the ability to do this thing, we should do it as opposed to just doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's like a big difference between inputs and outputs. And to your point, is like, yeah, Liquid Death may be actually leveraging a lot of these technologies and a lot of this data and a lot of these capabilities that are relatively sort of new that many of us in the industry obsess over, but the consumer doesn't know that they are. And I think that's another thing that like, I think we're having this kind of conversation that sort of ties back to the point about like your mission isn't necessarily the thing you need to communicate. Right. And I think just because I clicked on a web page and looked at a bag doesn't mean that I want to be contacted 5 more times reminding me that I looked at the bag and that it's still waiting in my cart.
In the same way that everybody's reminding me. They have innovation in that empty cart email as well. Yeah. If you've seen that online, saying like, hey man, this is me, the guy who writes these emails. I hope you didn't die. Yeah. You know, even that is not about the purchasing.
Right. And if you are going to do it in a way
creativity in every single
call it what it is.
What I love about you as a marketer and also Oatly as a brand, I'll say both of them at the same time, is I work in advertising, so we always think about the positioning P of marketing, which is like one P of many Ps, you know, but you guys have done so well in like just the placement of the product in the barista's hands. That was so genius. And the pricing of the product, like talk about how the brand, corporate comms of the brand, how did it work at Oatly that it felt like the brand was the brand and not like different communications, if that makes any sense?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say, and I've said this many times, that like, I didn't invent any of this. You know what I mean? Like in my time at Oatly, I inherited a lot of great ideas and structure and process or lack thereof. But so I want to give credit to the people that like actually designed things the way that they were designed. But one very critical decision that was made that I think is the partial answer to your question was sort of in the way that the creative and brand organization was structured. One of the first things that some of the most recent leadership did when they joined the company many, many years ago was to eliminate the marketing department. And by that, I don't mean that like we eliminated marketing, but realized that there were a lot of people sitting between the commercial side of the company or any of the major functions of the company, innovation, sales, sustainability, even supply chain operations, right? That possessed a lot of insight into opportunities, challenges, what have you, that were sort of buffered by a marketing team who would take that whole universe of information and insight and then filter it through a research process that then became the input to the creative brief that was then given to a creative team that was arm's reach away from the real kind of gooey sort of center of the company and the business. And so there was a commitment to eliminate those functions and just put the creative people at the table. And by creative people, again, I mean like the Oatly Department of Mind Control, as it still exists today and while I was there and before me, is responsible for making every decision about how we're going to position the brand, how it's going to show up in the world, the kind of communications we create, the partnerships we develop, how media dollars get planned and spent, soup to nuts, right? So there's marketing in that. But the people who are essentially creative directors in title in each of their respective regions were responsible to show up at that table and to really intimately understand what was happening in the marketplace, what our retailers were asking for, what some of the competitive challenges were, what was coming down the pike from a innovation perspective, what new products we were developing, and then go back and decide which of these things are we going to support, talk about how and in what way, but with almost no oversight from the C-suite or from anyone else in any of those other functions. And the contract was like, you show up and you participate in the business. And in exchange for that, you can have all the autonomy that you need to go decide how to execute. And we will not meddle until it stops working.
I want to ask 10,000 more questions, but I want to go back to the sentence because it's blowing my mind, which is we don't get involved until it's not working. I feel like most stakeholders at companies are trying to mitigate from it going wrong. We spend so much time trying to figure out if it's going to go wrong, how it's going to perform. Let's test this thing. Let's board it out. Let's sell it up. Let's sell it down. Let's sell it across. You know, like we're getting involved before it's even doing anything.
Yeah.
What does that contract look like? Like, what is that unspoken or spoken? Like, how are you able to act that way, I guess, as a marketer?
Trust, autonomy. It sounds very squishy, but like really that's what it's all about. I think there's like a thing that is missed in a lot of organizations where process and micromanagement become kind of substitutes for ambition and creativity and like innovation. Where it's like the leaders just forget, and I'm radically oversimplifying, but the leader, and in some cases, the leader might be the brand director who's briefing an agency. In some cases, the leader might be the CEO who's overseeing in-house creative department, right? But the person in charge is forgetting to ask for greatness and to then hold the people who are responsible for delivering greatness accountable on the other side. Yeah. And then everything in the middle is just sort of trust and empowerment.
Yeah.
Again, I'm radically oversimplifying, but like it is shocking to me, and like to draw from my experience at Vox. I was at Vox before I was at Oatly. Don't think we've talked about this yet, but like at Vox, it was almost like the inverse of my experience at Oatly, because at Vox, my team answered probably hundreds of RFPs a year. And I could probably count in any given year on one hand the number of briefs, be they delivered verbally or in writing, that were asking for something truly creatively amazing.
Right.
There were a lot of KPIs,
yeah,
and there were a lot of delivery expectations, and there were a lot of expectations around how the process was going to work and how many reviews there were going to be and the types of outputs and deliverables that we were going to be expected to provide. But very rarely did it start with like I want you to do something amazing, and I'm going to trust that no one knows better than you what amazing looks like in this part of the ecosystem that you own and live in every single day.
Yeah.
And I think that was like half the battle at Oatly.
I want to talk about the Vox thing in a second. I want to touch on almost two pieces of work, which I thought were fascinating. Can you talk about the minor league baseball partnership?
Yeah. I'm sure anybody who's watching this is like, really? Minor league
Minor league.
baseball?
That's what, okay. So you told me about this partnership. You were like, we're partnering with minor league baseball and we're going to sponsor teams. And I like just that sentence. I was immediately like, what a stupid idea.
Yeah.
And I like walked on flipping my hair.
Yeah.
And then
that's what a lot of my colleagues said.
And then you did the
like,
back napkin math of like, hey, here's how many people we're going to reach. Here's how it's going to work. And I looked at that math and I was just like, holy shit, this might be the best idea ever.
Yeah. I mean, a few things happened. A, they approached us and they were lovely and smart and creative. And so we were like, yeah, maybe there's some there. B, we were sort of at this crossroads where I think I mentioned earlier, to date, Oatly had really concentrated the majority of its communication in like a couple of major like markets that had national influence, right? New York, LA, maybe a couple of other cities. And we were starting to feel like if we're ever going to reach that goal of converting 50% of dairy drinkers to like my sister-in-law in a suburb of Atlanta needs to be a little bit more Oatly needs to be a little bit more top of mind for her, right? So it was like, how do we start to just like entrench in more markets, in smaller markets? And the minor league baseball network is built as almost a mirror to that strategy. It's like the perfect solution where like even most of their teams and their stadiums are located outside of the major metro centers in like all 50 states. And so from an efficiency perspective, it was like, that's a really great solution. And I don't think I'm sort of betraying minor leagues trust by saying like, it's a little bit more economical than it would be if you tried to sponsor MLB or NBA or NFL on a national level for sure. And given our relatively limited budgets, that was also appetizing. But more than anything else, we sort of went into these conversations and we said like, as is the case with most things Oatly does, we're not going to do something the way that everybody else does it. And so please help us get to something that feels truly spectacular. And the first couple meetings were a little bit rough. And then the third meeting, they came to us and they said, we're going to make you your own team. And I was like, oh, hell yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, hell yeah, we are. And it wasn't its own team, but basically the concept was for every one of the minor league baseball teams to play one game per season as the Malmo Oat Milkers.
So good.
Which is what they call an alter ego, which is something they do discreetly, like to coincide with certain holidays or like key moments and at a team level, like they do, but they'd never done it on a national scale and certainly not with with a sponsor, which is effectively what we were. And Malmo is the city in Sweden where Oatly is headquartered. So we said we obviously have to name a US baseball team. Malmo, and then Oat Milkers sort of speaks for itself.
It's so good because it's not like the Lansing Lugnuts are playing with an Oatly logo on their jersey that is immediately blocked out by my mind. It's the Lansing Lugnuts become the Oat,
and everything was professional grade, like like
new and every
era,
week it's a
new
different
era
team.
Caps. And then everything we did inside. And I think the other thing that I think was like really smart, we also as a brand were so committed to adding to the baseball experience. And so everywhere we showed up, we did with the intention to make the game more fun from the content that we produced. We produced a bunch of bespoke content for Jumbotrons, and we had a bunch of like in-stadium giveaways and even like the pre, during, and post promotion that we did around all the games. And we're like kind of in a way that I think annoyed the league. Now and then, we're also like just so ruthlessly committed to like doing it in the most authentic way where the stitching on the caps was debated for many, many weeks.
So every team, every market turned into the Oatly team, Oatly market for one game.
One per season.
And you got the whole country basically.
Yeah.
And each one was a specific partnership, promoted on their social, promoted on their team, promoted in their stadium, promoted by their players. I'm watching my player. That player's fucking wearing an Oatly jersey today.
And now when you start thinking about it, you're like, there were all of these like flywheel effects that we didn't even really anticipate that weren't in our like media plan or in the official contract, right? Where like now you've got local news outlets showing up at all the local games, photographing the games and covering them in the newspaper the day after. And guess who's on the front page of the sports section? It's like the Malmo Oat Milkers.
Right. It's not just like Lansing Lugnuts again, like I said, wearing a small logo on their shoulder that says Oatly.
Yeah.
That could be any logo in the world.
Yeah.
It's so genius when you do the media math. And it's so genius when you do the creative math. Which I think you guys did every time I've asked the question of creatively, it's amazing. but it doesn't media-wise make sense. And I've done the math, like the billboard you said we earlier talked about, or this like Oatly team. I'm immediately just like, that's such a shitty idea. And then I do the math. I'm like, this is fucking genius.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the reach.
Well, and for us as like creative
authenticity.
people, it is usually the other way around, right? Where it's like you have a great idea and then you like bend over backwards to make it contort to something that makes sense from a money perspective and from a efficiency perspective. In this case, it was like, oh, actually from a footprint perspective, for the budget we're talking about, like show me another media channel where I could get this depth of engagement at this broad reach.
That
and now let's
my
just
audience.
find the right way that like suits us to bring it to life. That also helps to enrich like the fans' experience.
You talked about the leadership getting involved when it's going wrong. What does going wrong mean? Because you have such a interesting brand, right? That talks in such an interesting way. And I love it. And I'm always walking by an Oatly billboard chuckling and saying like, good on you. Mm-hmm. As a marketer, you want all those reactions to be that like, oh man, these guys are killing it. But any brand that's doing really, really well is getting a certain amount of, not a tip of a hat, the opposite of like, well, fuck these people. And I think that gets a lot of marketers really, really restricted. Immediately they pull back and be like, well, let's not do that. Can you, from your point of view, talk about like, is there a cohort of people that doesn't like the Oatly brand? How do they interact and how do you think about them?
Yeah. And I think it's good to say, to the credit of Oatly and its leadership, that like people hating Oatly was never deemed a failure. I mean, obviously you want the most amount of people to be loving your brand and like enjoying your product, but it was another sort of feature, I think, in Oatly's code that I think in many companies is deemed a bug, which was we need to listen to those people too, but we're also not going to shy away from it. And in fact, I don't necessarily believe that like any press is good press.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or like, so
there's bad press.
Certainly. Yeah. And in some cases, like, you know, when the negative commentary sort of reaches a fever pitch, you listen and you respond and you actually feed that into your strategy and you go, oh, actually enough people are talking about this thing or talking shit about this thing that we should address it. Right. Yeah. But for the most part, our strategy was to not only not avoid the negative comments, but to like respond to them and lean into them. The best example of this was, again, not an idea that I had, but something that we launched out of our European team was fuckoatly.com, which was a website that was essentially like an aggregate of all the gripes that people most commonly had with us. And it was everything from like, which investors are we taking money from, to the ingredients in our product, to our advertising, and sort of just decided,
the loudest
like,
complainers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what are the most consistent sort of
right
themes that are kind of surfacing in some of the like backlash that we get? And again, instead of like burying it, we exposed it, we put it all in one place and used it as an opportunity for humor, right? Yeah. And so a lot of the response
was you made fuckoatly.com.
We made fuckoatly.com, and it was an opportunity for us to address some of these issues in our own tongue-in-cheek way.
Yeah.
At first, we just built the site and we sort of left it there, and nobody really knew that it existed. And then it so happens that somebody from our team was speaking at a conference or something and mentioned it, and then it sort of like took off. Yeah.
It's also so interesting because like I know a lot of marketers, a lot of CPG marketers, a lot of marketers in the space that we were like, okay, we need to respond to this negative comments and address these things and tell them our side of the story. And we're going to do it as fuckoatly.com. They would immediately be like, no, shouldn't it be Oatly's awesome? Buy it anyway.com.
Yeah.
You know?
Should we give them a promo code?
Yeah. Should we respond to them and say, sorry for your bad experience. Here's a free thing that you don't like anyway.
Yeah. Or someone will contact you on the DL.
Right. Yeah. Don't say this online. Yeah. We will contact you one-on-one.
Yeah.
It's such a different way to respond.
Yeah.
And that feels like it's built into DNA. And it's also a little bit of what, like you were saying, seeing it as a feature and not as a bug.
Yeah.
Seeing that hate and the negativity as a part of the system.
Yeah.
And a positive part of the system.
Yeah.
As a positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
Is there anyone at the organization that raises their hand and says, wait, why does it say fuck Oatly? No.
A lot less than you would think there is.
Yeah.
You know, and the other thing that I think it does, which is a relevant lesson, like we're talking a lot about Oatly, but I think a lot of in this conversation, I think are a lot of lessons that are actually quite universally applicable.
I think they're applicable to people
and are probably hard to adopt in big matrixed companies that are very entrenched in a certain way of working, but like maybe easier than you think they are if you have sort of the right leadership or if you're seizing the right moment to kind of change the way you think and work. But what it does also, a lot of this negativity, if you harness it in the right way, is it creates two opposing poles, right? So it's like you're never going to have 100% of people loving you. And so if you can address the 50% who don't in the right way, then the 50% who do will respect you even more. And in many cases will come to your rescue.
Right.
You know, like sometimes we were actually not even stoking the debate. We were just kind of watching it unfold. Right. And before we could even chime in, it had sort of resolved itself.
Fuck Oatly is just as much for people who love Oatly,
exactly,
as it is.
In fact,
for
it's probably more
so because it's a
flex.
It's a website they can post. It's a website they can say, "Oh fuck, that's why I love this thing.
Yeah,
that is why I love this brand.
Yeah,
because
yeah, that's right.
I think it running the brand studio at Vox. Yeah, right. Is that what it's?
Yeah,
is that how it's summed up?
Yeah, branded content business
at Vox.
Yeah, team.
What is that like, and how is that structured philosophically, organizationally different than the philosophical structure of the brand at Oatly?
I mean, obviously different in so many ways.
What were you trying to do there that felt
it was almost like the opposite problem?
Yeah,
where you're trying to make a great creative product for a brand inside of a company that doesn't do what you do. Like Vox Media's may make its money on advertising and branded content, but like that's not its purpose, right? Its purpose is to produce great journalism and entertainment and content, right? So that's one challenge. The other is even just within the advertising ecosystem that Vox had created. Most buyers, well, first of all, most buyers of Vox Media are not creative people. And they're not makers. They are media planners and buyers or heads of investment for brands and big agency networks, right? So those people, not to typecast, are because it's their job, primarily focused on the numbers, on scale and on reach and on engagement and on quantifiable results that you associate with audiences interacting with ads and content. Yeah. Right. And how much of that can I get at the greatest value for my client? I'm sort of responsible for a team that is making a lot of content and telling a lot of stories and trying to do the best creative work that they can do for that audience. And in a lot of cases, the incentives were sometimes feeling like they were misaligned, but it was like I was saying, kind of the inverse paradigm in comparison to Oatly, in the sense that it was very much about scale, very much about measurability, very much about delivery, very much about like, how can I get the most amount of content in front of the most amount of people? And then it was like, can we do something cool?
Yeah.
And that made me sad a lot of the time.
Why?
Well, because I think if you, and I guess this goes for any kind of marketing discipline or business, is like, if you start with a KPI, if you start with a media KPI, then I'm only ever going to deliver the media KPI. But if you tell me to do something amazing, or if the ultimate ambition is something that is like creatively profound, then I will most likely exceed your KPI. Yeah, I think the point I'm trying to make is like, it always just amazes me how often people who are procuring creative services forget to ask for something great. Yeah. Like I said, we looked at hundreds of RFPs a year. And by the way, all of your RFPs sound exactly the same. Like they're like, that is another thing that makes me really sad, actually, on behalf of the RFP writers. Yeah. You are spending so much time agonizing over every word in your brief, and you think they all sound so unique and differentiated, and they don't.
They're all the same.
Yeah. But also, you don't need a unique and differentiated RFP or brief to get to a very unique idea.
Do you need to?
You just have to ask for a unique idea and be willing to take a chance on it.
And be willing for that to not be the answer you already have in your head.
That's right.
You're at Vox. You answered 100. I don't even know how fuck you physically answered 100 RFPs, but you did. Thanks. You congrats. Um,
I'm not proud of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
You answer 100 RFPs. It sounds like you're not having any of those conversations.
I mean, in many cases, what you end up having to do is sort of identify the 10 or 20% of clients that are going to like privilege you with their time and with their insight and with their data and with like, I don't know, invite me to your factory, whatever, right?
Give me some input.
Yeah. And you're probably over delivering a bit for those. And you're just sort of choosing these are the ones that I can go deep with and where I can do something truly spectacular. And for the rest, we'll give them the best version of what they're asking for that we can deliver. And I think in so doing, we were also able to, I'd like to say without sounding kind of too full of myself, that like between the time I arrived at Vox and the time that I left, the type of work we were creating was sort of night and day, right? I mean, by the time I left, we had produced a handful of feature-length documentaries that ended up ultimately living on the major streaming platforms and original podcasts for the likes of Ben and Jerry's. But in each of those cases, and also, by the way, I'm not claiming that like every brand should be in the business of trying to make feature-length films.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was right for those people at that time. And it took a lot of partnership and collaboration and also a lot of internal kind of because like even within Vox Media, the system didn't understand. They were like, what are you trying to do? And how much is that going to cost? And why are we making a podcast for this brand? Eventually, like through the right level of collaboration. But even in those cases, like it didn't really start with a brief. It started with like we have an interesting story to tell, or we think we have an interesting point of view on something that's occurring in culture. You guys are a news company.
Tell the story.
And experts at unscripted content. Can you help us like figure out how to bring this to life? And then let's make the math make sense, right? Because we need to make sure that we don't spend all this money and time making a movie that nobody sees.
I came to you like about 5-6 months ago.
Yeah.
And I remember because I came to you, you were just, you've left Oatly for however a few months and you were just about to leave Oatly and you were like, and I said, would you, I was telling you about Mojo, but I was like, would you go agency side again? I don't think I finished the sentence and you were like, fuck no.
Yeah.
What? Tell me about that. Like, why not go back to an agency thing? I was immediately like, I was just like, okay, this lunch is over.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I did say that, didn't I?
You said that a month ago too, by the way.
And I think there's still a part of me that is thinking maybe never.
Yeah.
But I think two things. I think when I said that, what I meant was when I said I don't ever want to work for an agency again, I think what I meant was like I don't want to work for most agencies.
Yeah.
Again. And I think really one of the main reason is that I just feel like I'm at a point in my career where the 50% of time and bandwidth that I spend doing a lot of the bullshit that you and I have just spent the better part of an hour talking about is wasted when I could be spending it thinking and making and solving problems. And I just think there's a lot of waste in the sort of agency client system and dynamic.
Not at every agency, I can tell you that.
Yeah, well, it would seem not, but in my experience.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I meant. On the flip side of that, now that I've had a few months to reflect, it's hard to find a single brand, you know, if I wanted to continue on the journey that I'm on and work inside of a brand, it's hard to find a single brand that is so perfectly aligned with my taste and my philosophy that just doing cool shit is half the path to success,
right?
At least, where you don't sort of get mired in a lot of the other distractions. And I do, there's days where I miss the variety and dynamism of an agency. And so sure, have I completely ruled it out? No, there's a part of me that also thinks like, if you don't love most of the work that's being done by agencies, then why don't you fucking go to an agency and
fix it?
Yeah. Which is not to claim that I have like many big ideas for big solutions, but like, get in there and do something about it.
Your marketing career, and I think this if there was any advice that I can glean from you I wanted to ask if you have any advice for the youngins, but I'll just give what I've found from your career that's so fascinating is people are so afraid of doing something different. And when you look at your resume, it feels like it makes no sense and it makes all the sense in the world. Like it feels like at every jump, there was 1,000 people telling you, Armando, don't do that.
Yeah.
But you did it. And when I look backwards, it's the perfect thing. Like you were at agencies, you've run a big agency, you've run a small agency that's like a consultancy, and then you've gone to a media company and run a media company side of things. And then you've gone to, I think, arguably one of the best brands in the world and saying, I'm going to become a marketer and get on Adweek Best Creative 100 list. And it feels...
I wish I could say all of this was by design.
No, but yeah. What is that made you do all those things? Is it a philosophy? What is it? Like if you could give advice to, I think you're one of the greatest marketers out there right now. How does a marketer pick up that philosophy that makes you that way?
Yeah, look, I think some of it, first of all, thank you for all of that. It's humbling to hear. And also I don't actually, I think I attribute a lot of it to just happenstance and the universe and all that shit. Because I didn't really have a clear plan. I think I'm a lifelong learner. Like I think it makes me uncomfortable when I don't know something. Yeah. And so I often gravitate toward experiences where I know I'm going to learn something new. Just try to sort of like look at where things are going, look at where people are going, look at like where the money is flowing, look at who's doing some of the most interesting kind of new and hopefully sustainable work. So those are, I think, the rational sort of answers to your question. You know, when I left BBH, like, you know, in the span of a year, I went from BBH to Red Scout to Vox after having been at BBH for 9 years. I had spent my last year and a half at BBH, actually doing something that we haven't even talked about, but like in a head of talent role. Well, effectively, I was.
You went from head of account to a head of talent role.
Yeah,
so
where I was effectively leading HR, recruitment, some M&A work, learning and development, like a lot of people-oriented stuff. And one of the reasons I took that role was because we were starting to see a lot of people leaving agencies to go work at platforms and publishers, and wanted to try to diagnose why that was happening and then stop it. And then I think in seeing why they were doing it, I want to do it too. And I was like, yeah, I should go do that. Yeah. So I did. But also like the softer factors, a sense of purpose. You know, I joined Vox, maybe not coincidentally, a month after Donald Trump was elected president the first time. And there was something very motivating about going to work for a company of independent journalists that were changing the hearts and minds of people and doing really good, thoughtful reporting. And then to go work for Oatly, which is really, I think, doing an important thing as much as it does it through a lot of humor, is doing a really great thing for the world. And so, yeah, I think kind of also leading with your conscience is like
it's so funny. If you hear me talk outside of a podcast, I love Netflix. I love Vox when it was at that time. I love that company. I love Oatly as a brand. Like you've managed to track some of these things. BBH at that time, holy shit, you know, doing the best work of their careers. You've managed to track some of my favorite companies at that time. And your, I think, curiosity and ability to be in a room where like, okay, I'm effectively the head of brand creative at Oatly. I'm not a creative. Let's go. You know, just the ability to be like, I'm at Vox, which is a media company, which I know nothing about. Here we go.
Yeah.
And or even within the agency, going from head of account to head of talent, which is completely different jobs. And I don't know how you made that jump. Let's talk offline about that, because it's nuts. Like, how do you even ask for that? It's a completely different job. And you being like, I have known nothing about HR, but I think I'm going to be the head of people at this agency.
There's a very specific piece of advice I would give, though, which is that, like, if you're interviewing for a role or you're interested in a role, gauge their appetite for blank slate thinking.
Right.
I remember when I was interviewing at Vox, Lindsay Nelson hired me at Vox, and I met Lindsay 3 times before she offered me the role. We had breakfast, and then we had lunch, and then we had dinner. So the tab, the amount
Huge
of the
tab.
tab was increasing.
Fancy
Yeah,
places.
yeah, which I thought was a good sign. But every time I met her, I said to her, I just want to make sure that you know that I've never worked at a media company before.
Yeah.
And I said it once and then I said it twice. And then finally she was like, Armando, why are you so fucking obsessed with this? Like, I'm hiring you because you've never worked at a media company before.
Yeah.
And I was like, bingo. Like, that's the kind of place you want to work.
Yeah.
And that's like, I think those are the kind of people that are going to like really appreciate like lateral thinking and new perspective. And like, I think there's this, I'm going to totally botch this, but there's this quote that's like, in the mind of the beginner, the possibilities are endless. In the mind of the expert, they are few. I've always said to everyone who joined my team, like, seize the newbie window. Like, your first 3 months is when you're going to have your best thinking, or at least where you're going to be the most eyes wide open about what's wrong here.
Yeah.
And just like, please pay attention to that, because after a while, you're going to drink all the Kool-Aid or the oat milk or whatever you're going to drink.
Right. You're going to be too close.
You're thinking like everybody else.
I have so many other questions for you. I want to talk AI and stuff, but film is very expensive.
Yes.
And it's rolling. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Yeah, this has been the best.
Awesome.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And congrats to you.
Thank you. Thanks. And
cool.
we'll
More
do
soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.